Chapter 19. The following day, Dana pulled herself away from Gypsy to drive into town. She only felt comfortable enough to do it because Gypsy was doing so well. Like Sam had said, and Dana had to agree, Gypsy was going to be just fine, so long as Dana didn't allow anyone to ride him, including herself. Speaking of Sam, Dana wanted to talk to him, to let him know that she didn't blame him for what had happened with school. She scolded herself for even telling him. She hadn't wanted him to know because she thought he'd laugh at her for being so weak-willed and foolish. Dana hadn't expected him to feel guilty about it. And somehow, it just didn't sit right with her that he did. That's why she headed to Whisper Falls, to go see him. To let him know she didn't blame him for the choices she'd made and didn't want him to either. Maybe, just maybe, Dana thought, Sam and I can find a little common ground. At least enough for us to find a way to be friends. After all, they were going to be living in the same town from here on out. Dana's car rolled to a stop in an empty space across the street from Parker's boarding house. Grand Street was crowded today. Good, Dana thought, killing the engine. People were out and about, spending money, which was good for the economy. She checked her rearview mirror, spotting the silver Lexus RX parked beside Sam's truck. It, too, had California plates. Damn, Dana laughed. We're being invaded by Californians. Oh well, she thought, reaching for the door handle. She held her hand there long enough to glance up in the rearview mirror again. Sam and a brunette exited through the front door. Dana froze. As they trotted down the steps, the woman latched her arm around Sam's. Dana's heart thudded against her chest, then slammed up into her throat when he draped his arm around the woman's shoulders. Sam laughed as he dragged his cousin closer. Audrey, I can't begin to tell you how much your coming down here is helping me. Well, she said, laying her hand against his chest, you just figure out a way to make it up to that girl of yours. The sooner you do that, the sooner I can go home. Audrey was laughing now. Sam attributed it to her comedic nature. They both stopped beside his truck. She said, Seriously, how long are you going to be gone? He heard the worry in her voice, and he wanted to calm her fears right away. He said, Just a few days. There are no appointments scheduled until Monday. Charlotte knows that until I return, you'll only be responding to emergency situations. Good, she nodded. That'll give me a chance to get acquainted with the clinic. I'd like to scan the files. Sam opened the driver's door. You hold the fort down, and I'll be back before you know it, he said, climbing inside. He gave Audrey a nod, then closed the door. She went back inside the boarding house. Sam hit the ignition switch, and the vehicle fired to life. Before he could shift into gear, his cell rang. His literary agent. Sam took the call through his truck's speakers. Phyllis, what's up? I'm calling about that proposal. Sam couldn't help but laugh to himself. That had been the last thing on his mind since he'd come to Whisper Falls. I just don't think I'm going to have time to do that, he said. Tell them I'm grateful for the opportunity, but it's just not going to work out. Are you sure, Sam? She asked. You're turning down an awful lot of money. Sam laughed again. Money isn't everything, Phyllis. You want a couple of days to think about it? Sam shook his head and laughed. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. 15 minutes after Sam left and the woman went back inside the boarding house, Dana was still sitting frozen in her car, with all sorts of scenarios dashing around chaotically inside her head. But the one that stuck out the most left her thinking, boy, that sure didn't take long. Who is that woman? She found herself asking out loud. Dana rifled through the handful of conversations she'd had with Sam since he'd arrived in town almost 2 months ago. She was sure of it. Sam had told her he was single, as in, not married. God, I'm such a fool, echoed through her head. Here she was, worried about some apparently imaginary burden of guilt she thought Sam might be carrying around. And while she'd worried about it all night, what was he out doing? A chill leveled Dana at the very thought of it. How stupid she had been to think they could somehow get over the past and become friends. This was likely how she'd ended up with her broken heart in the first place. And the worst part about the whole thing was that Dana was still in love with Sam. She had to own it. She didn't have to like it, but she did have to admit it, if to no one but herself. She would never be able to watch Sam be married to or in love with someone else. Dana reached for her phone to call Amelia. When she answered, Dana asked, "How's your day looking? Want to meet me for an early lunch?" She heard Amelia sigh before saying, "I've got meetings all morning and through the early afternoon. I couldn't get away until about 3." Dana glanced at the clock on her dashboard. 10:30. 3 was hours away. She pushed her disappointment aside and said, "Okay, 3 sounds good. Della's Cafe?" "Perfect," Amelia said. "Great, see you then," Dana said, then disconnected the call and went home. By 1:30, she was in her car again and headed back to Whisper Falls. Sure, she was early for her late lunch with Amelia, but Dana had hopes of catching Sam at the clinic. She had a few things to say to him, and none of it matched the thoughts that had been roaming around in her head this morning when she'd gone to see him at the boarding house. The midday summer heat swelled around Dana as she left her car and headed for the clinic's front entrance. She opened the door and was pleased with the blast of cool air from inside. "Hey, Charlotte," she said, finally used to seeing someone from Sinclair Enterprises manning the receptionist's desk. According to her brother Ray, he'd loaned Charlotte to Sam until he could find someone else. Dana still thought it was weird how buddy-buddy her brother and Sam were these days. She asked, "Sam in the back?" Charlotte shook her head. "He's not here, Dana." She pointed over her shoulder. "Audrey's in back, though." "Who?" The word fell from Dana's mouth, but she chased it away with another thought. Where is he? It would have been nice if he'd at least told her he was leaving. What if Gypsy needed him? "He's gone to the Bay Area." Charlotte stopped abruptly when Dana's attention shot to the doorway behind her. There stood the same woman that Sam had been all over earlier. Well, maybe not all over, but they sure were friendly with one another. Based on what Dana witnessed earlier in the day, they had to know each other well. The woman smiled at Dana, then let her gaze drift toward Charlotte. She asked, "Do you need me?" Charlotte looked at Dana. "Gypsy's okay, right?" "Yes," Dana nodded. She looked back at the woman. "Sorry, I was just looking for Sam." Her voice trailed off as she lost the ability to string together any more comprehensible words. But Dana would be the bigger person here. When Sam found out his girlfriend had met his ex, she wanted to make sure the woman couldn't say anything more than, "She was perfectly pleasant." Well, that's what she'd say if she told the truth. Dana stepped toward her and offered her hand. "I'm Dana Sinclair." She was a pretty brunette with huge green eyes. Dana could see what Sam saw in her. She was gorgeous. And Ms. Gorgeous broke into a huge smile as she rushed toward Dana. "Oh my God, Dana!" The woman hugged her. "I've heard so much about you. It's great to finally meet you." "She's heard about me?" Bounced into Dana's thoughts. Why would his new love know all about his ex? This wasn't making sense. She looked at Ms. Gorgeous and asked, "Who are you again?" "Sorry," she said. "I'm Audrey Curtis, Sam's cousin. I've just come down to help him out while he settles in." Sam's cousin? And suddenly the clouds cleared. "I'm very pleased to meet you, Audrey," Dana said with a smile. "When is Sam coming back?" "It's just a short business trip." She waved it off as if it were nothing. He'll be back in a few days. Why don't you give him a call? I bet he'd like to hear from you," she added with a wink. Dana felt her face flush warm. Of course she wanted to call him in the worst way, but she would contain herself or die trying. After several more minutes of friendly, non-committal chit-chat, Dana excused herself, saying she was going to be late for an appointment, so they all said their goodbyes. Dana got in her car and drove the 3 blocks to Main Street, turned left, and traveled the 2 blocks to Della's Cafe. Amelia was already there. Dana parked beside her sedan, jumped out, and headed inside. Amelia was sitting at a booth near the front and already had a glass of raspberry iced tea waiting for Dana. Sliding into the booth across from her, Dana grabbed her glass and asked, "Is there booze in this?" "Booze?" Amelia laughed. "Rough day, huh?" Dana felt her confidence and composure fading away. "Just focus," she coached herself. "And whatever you do, don't cry." The thought itself nearly brought her to tears. "Hey." Amelia reached across the table to touch Dana's arm. "Is Gypsy okay?" She nodded. "Gypsy's going to be fine." Dana would never ride him again, but he was alive. That's all that mattered. Amelia asked, "Then why the long face?" Dana let out a heavy sigh. Amelia leaned back in the booth, crossed her arms over her chest, and said, "Sam." She sat there smiling at Dana for the longest time, then finally added, "What happened?" Damn it. Dana hated that about her friend since first grade. She always knew when there was more to the story than Dana was telling. She shook her head, then shrugged, hoping her tones sounded dismissive and indifferent as she said, "I just can't stay on this roller coaster ride." "So Sam Trevorton is a roller coaster ride now." Amelia's unrestrained laughter cut through Dana like a jagged knife. "Sam can do whatever the hell he wants," Dana said, reaching for the menu. She picked it up, focusing on it rather than the subject that her friend was so determined to discuss. "Especially if he's going to do it to you, right?" "Stop it," Dana said, then laughed giddily at the thought of it. Amber, the waitress, strolled toward them. "Dana, Amelia, how's it going?" she asked, pausing at their table. Her eyes landed on Dana as she added, "Say, I heard that something happened to your horse." She waited for Dana to look at her, then added, "A mountain lion, was it?" After Dana nodded, Amber's gray eyes opened up right along with her smile. "Did Sam, that gorgeous new vet in town, take care of him?" "Yeah, he did." Dana nodded. "Sam's very good at what he does." Amelia threw in, "Dana and Sam are old friends." She said it with all the innuendo one would expect from Amelia, who didn't care for Amber at all. Truth be told, Dana was starting not to care for how eager Amber seemed to be about Sam, like they were involved or something. But Amber took Amelia's comment in stride. She simply looked at Dana and said, "Is that right? Do you know if he's involved with anyone?" "I couldn't tell you," Dana said. "I didn't ask him." Of course, Sam had implied that he was single, but Dana had no way of knowing if it was true. Damn, she should have asked his cousin. As if Amber were reading Dana's mind, she said, "Maybe I could ask his cousin." She shot Dana a cheeky smile, then added, "You know, I heard that she's come over to help him get settled in. She's a veterinarian, too." "That's very thoughtful of her," Dana said, and found herself wanting to one-up Amber in the Sam Trevorton department. "Audrey is very nice. Plus, she knows her stuff." "I think I'll drop by the clinic and have a chat with her," Amber said. "Maybe she can set us up on a date," she added dreamily. Glancing down at Dana and Amelia, she seemed to realize where she was and what she was doing at the diner. Promptly, she took their orders, a burger and fries for Dana and a club sandwich for Amelia, then strolled away. Have you ever seen anyone so obviously desperate in your life? Amelia said with distaste practically oozing from her tone. Yeah, maybe. Dana barely breathed out the words before her voice trailed off. She just wasn't sure who was more desperate, Amber in her aggressive pursuit of Sam, or Dana in her hapless attempt to stop her. Maybe Audrey was right. Maybe it was time to call Sam. Chapter 20. Dana spent the next couple of days focusing all of her attention on Gypsy's health and trying not to let the thought of Sam Treverton get under her skin again. Although, she was a little too late for that. After dinner that night, she grabbed a glass of wine and the bottle and headed upstairs, where she intended to enjoy a quiet evening on the balcony off her bedroom, gazing at the stars. She liked doing that. It made her forget. She slipped into her room, eased the door shut, and set her glass on the dresser. After slipping into a tank top and a pair of boxers, she grabbed her phone and glass of wine and stepped out onto the balcony. The boxers were a habit she'd picked up while dating Sam. When she was at his apartment, she'd oftentimes slip into a clean pair of his boxers instead of getting dressed. Dana placed her phone on the small table beside the curved-back chaise lounge and sat down while steadying her glass carefully. Twilight had begun to settle over the pinyon pine and the rolling hills beyond it. Dana sipped her wine and tried to ignore her phone on the table nearby. Today had been an eye-opener. She wasn't about to forget how she'd felt when Amber mentioned asking Sam out. Dana had already had a shot of that particular medicine that morning when she'd spotted Sam cozying up to another woman outside the boarding house. Thankfully, she had turned out to be his cousin. There would be no such reprieve if he and Amber started dating. Dana knew what she had to do. But was she ready? Was she ready to call him? Was she ready to make the first move? Dana's heart banged against her chest at the thought of it. Sure, he seemed like he wanted to get back together with her, but was that real? Was he serious? Or the moment she bared her soul, would he laugh at her? Tell her he was only kidding? Could the Sam she knew and loved be so cruel? Honestly, Dana didn't know. She never would have thought he'd turn his back on her, not in a million years, but he'd done just that, while claiming to still love her. Nope. Words would mean nothing when it came to Sam Treverton. She'd seen firsthand that his actions alone would tell the tale. She could not push the phone's presence out of her head, even though she'd purposefully avoided looking at it since sitting down. It's like it was nagging at her. Look at me. Pick me up. Call Sam. But had she waited too long to latch on to his olive branch? Had she waited too long to hear him out? Had she waited too long to just stop talking and kiss him? She wasn't sure. She was certain of one thing, though. She did not want to see Sam sporting Amber around town on his arm. She downed the rest of the wine in her glass and poured herself another before she picked up her cell phone and called Sam. The phone buzzed in her ear like a warning signal to hang up. Now, before it was too late. Dana kept listening. It was like she was frozen and couldn't move. Hang up, her nerves bellowed. Then she heard a clicking noise that was quickly followed by, "Hey, Dana, Gypsy okay?" Yes. She swallowed around the lump in her throat, then added, "Sorry if I'm calling at a bad time." His lingering laughter poured over her like a dram of rare scotch. "Oh, come on, Dana. You know there's no bad time for you to call. How's Gypsy?" "He's doing much better, thanks. I met your cousin at the clinic today." "Good. I'm glad. How do you like her?" "She's incredibly nice. I like her." Dana tried her best to sound pleasant. "I didn't meet her when we were together, did I?" "No," he said. "She was back east then, I think. You met her brothers, though. Remember Neil and Adam?" "Oh, yeah." Dana chuckled at the memory of them, two goofballs who were always pulling stunts, but you could count on them both in a pinch. They were a lot of fun. They've never let me hear the end of it after... Sam's words trailed off, and Dana was grateful that he hadn't said it. She didn't want to think about that anymore. She'd made up her mind. She was moving past it. Besides, Sam was living in her hometown now. He'd come back for her. That had to count for something, right? When are you coming home? The words fell out of her mouth before she had a chance to even consider them. Audrey told me that you were gone to the Bay Area to see Fancy. How's she doing? I'm seeing her tomorrow, he said, right before I head back. Aw, give her a hug for me. And she couldn't resist adding with a hint of laughter, and a kiss from Gypsy. A nagging thought crept into her head. If he wasn't seeing Fancy until tomorrow, and he'd been there for 2 days already, what had he been doing all that time? Sam said, I will definitely do that. He went silent, and it felt like eons before he spoke again. I've run away with the conversation, he said. Was there a specific reason that you called? Dana's heart sank. He wanted off the phone. Not really, she said, barely above a whisper. After regaining her voice, she added, I just wanted to update you on Gypsy. Audrey said you were worried. That last bit was an out-and-out lie. Oh, sure, of course he was worried about Gypsy, just like he'd be worried about any patient of his, but Audrey hadn't told her that. By now, though, Dana was grasping at straws, just so she could save face. Hey, she added, and couldn't help but smile when she said it. It was nice talking to you. Sam disconnected the call and tried to push his guilt aside. He shouldn't let his guard down, even though it had been so tempting to do once he heard her cheerful voice. It had easily seduced him. But Sam couldn't forget that he had completely failed Dana. Again. He'd spent the last 2 days at the university and had been promptly shot down, no matter who he talked to. It seemed that Janice Arrington, one of Dana's old professors, was now the dean of veterinary medicine, and not only that, she was also up several other deans' butts. She was holding a personal grudge against Dana for quitting. When Sam met with Janice the day before, she'd acted like Dana had done something to her personally when she walked away from school. She made it clear, in no uncertain terms, that Dana would never be welcomed back to the university, or any other, if Janice could stop it. And Sam knew Janice Arrington would go to great lengths to stop Dana from gaining admittance into any veterinary school in the country. Sam had no idea what he was going to do now. His whole plan to win her back hinged upon him helping Dana graduate. He had to build up her trust in him again. How could Sam regain her trust if he couldn't give her back what he'd taken from her? Chapter 21. The following Thursday morning, Ray drove into Whisper Falls to drop by the clinic. He knew Sam had returned the day before, and he was eager to learn the university's position. Ray had allowed himself to become vaguely optimistic and hopeful for a positive outcome. It would be nice to see Dana get the recognition she deserved. However, he wasn't overlooking the fact that Dana had brought this on herself. Even so, that didn't mean his little sister should suffer for the rest of her life, all because of one little mistake on her part. Plus, Dana had hurt no one but herself. The bell over the door jingled when Ray walked into the clinic. He paused just inside the doorway. Where was Charlotte? Ray could hear voices, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. A man and a woman, he thought. Maybe Charlotte was back there. He stepped toward the counter and called out, "Hello?" Straight away, Sam appeared in the doorway leading to the back. In another instant, an incredibly gorgeous woman with dark hair and the most intoxicating green eyes Ray had ever seen stepped into the doorway beside Sam. When her eyes met Ray's, she graced him with a smile that seemed to light up her whole face. He couldn't be sure, but he thought his heart might have done a flip-flop. Who was this lovely woman? Ray looked at Sam and said, "Sorry if I'm interrupting." His eyes drifted back to her. "I was in the area. Thought I'd drop by." He couldn't stop himself from wanting to know who she was. She wasn't from around here. Ray was sure of that. He'd made it a point, long ago, to know all the pretty women in town. "Not a problem, Ray." Sam moved around the counter and headed toward him. As he got closer, Ray extended his hand. Sam accepted it. As they shook, Sam said with a gesture toward Audrey, "This is my cousin, Audrey Curtis. She's come over from the Bay Area to help out for a few months." "Oh, yes. I remember you mentioned something about that." Ray stepped toward Audrey. She offered her hand, but instead of shaking it, he drew it up to his lips and kissed it. She blushed. He still had a hold of her hand when he glanced at Sam and said, "Why don't you just hire her?" Sam laughed. "I would, in a heartbeat, if she'd stay." He got serious as he studied Ray. "Think you can talk her into it?" But Ray didn't like the sound of Sam's tone. Made it seem like she wasn't open to living out in the boonies. That was a shame. "I'd give it a hell of a try," Ray said, winking at Audrey. Audrey smacked Sam's upper arm. He straightened, then said, "Audrey, this is Ray Sinclair." Her eyes perked up with her smile as she waved her finger at Ray, but her eyes were on Sam. "Any relation to—" "Dana's brother," Sam said. Audrey stepped toward Ray and wrapped her arm around his. "I have heard such good things about your sister." She smiled, and he got the feeling that it was meant solely for him. "I'm liking her more and more every minute." "Sam," Ray said, his eyes glued to Audrey, "would you and Audrey like to have lunch with me?" "You buying?" Sam laughed. "Most definitely." Sam looked at Audrey. "What do you say, cuz?" She anchored a hand casually on one hip and said to Ray, "That's a very generous and enticing offer. But alas, I'm afraid we cannot." "No?" Ray laid his hand across his chest. She beamed. So Ray poured it on thick. "You cut me to the core." "Blame him." She nodded at Sam. "It's his fault." "What'd I do?" Sam asked, as if he too had been cut to the core. "We can't go to lunch," she said to Sam, "with Dana's very handsome brother because you have not found us a place to live yet." She let her gaze drift back toward Ray and said in a much friendlier tone, "My brothers are bringing some of my things up tomorrow, and we have nowhere to put them." She shrugged. "Because he," her eyes rolled toward Sam, "didn't bother to find us somewhere to live." Ray knew that they were currently staying in two very small apartments at Parker's boarding house over on Grand Street. Ray didn't know much about the current state of Whisper Falls real estate market, but he supposed he could put his real estate broker Monica Dane on it, but that could take weeks. Ray didn't want Audrey to have any excuse to go back to the Bay Area before he had a chance to sweep her off her feet. Then it hit him. Ray had the perfect solution. "I've got your problem solved," he announced with pride. Both Sam and Audrey looked at him with bated breath. "Well?" Sam urged him to go on. "You both need a place to live. I have a penthouse with 3 bedrooms here in town." He shrugged and shook his head. "I never use it. You both are more than welcome to stay there as long as you want." Audrey said to Ray, "That's very generous of you, but we couldn't possibly—" Her voice trailed off as her gaze shifted to Sam. "Could we? Are you sure?" Sam asked Ray. "Absolutely." Ray laid on the charm. "I won't take no for an answer." And he meant it. He had no intention of giving Audrey Curtis a single reason to leave Whisper Falls. Everybody knew that Ray Sinclair Jr. always got what he wanted. Chapter 22. On Friday, Dana took her lunch: a sandwich and chips, a glass of iced tea, some sliced apples, bananas, carrots, and a special treat, a cookie to share with Gypsy, out to the stables. Gypsy was doing so much better these days, and Dana couldn't be happier about it. She settled on a blanket in Gypsy's stall and began feeding him pieces of fruit between her bites of the sandwich. Dana's phone buzzed. She checked the display and answered right away. "Amelia, what's going on?" "I'm just wondering what's going on with you and Sam. Didn't he get back a couple of days ago?" "Yeah," Dana said, "on Wednesday." "Why haven't you called me? What happened?" "Nothing," Dana said with a shrug. "I haven't seen him." "I thought you would have seen him by now." "I talked to him on the phone." "So? What happened? Did he tell you he still loves you? Did you tell him you still love him?" "Calm down, Amelia." Dana doubted that her nervous laughter echoing through the phone was actually doing anything to help Amelia relax. Still, knowing it would probably just fuel the fire, she fed Amelia the little information she had. "We talked about Gypsy." "That's it?" "Yup." Dana blew out her frustration with a sigh. "I think I may have waited a little too long to forgive Sam." She shrugged and bit back the urge to cry. "I think he's done." She nodded. "I think he's ready to move on." "What did he say specifically?" "It wasn't anything he said, per se." Dana shook her head. "It's just that the last couple of times I've talked to him, when we start getting friendly, it seems like that's the time when he's all of a sudden in this big hurry to get off the phone." "You know," Amelia paused. It was a tactic Dana knew well. The girl was about to bring home her point, which was never a good thing. Usually because she was right. "You get that you're going to have to do something super drastic, don't you?" When Amelia said drastic, she always meant it. Dana's nervous laughter continued, but now it was cradling around her. "I am not chasing after any man, not even one who's as good in the sack as Sam Treverton." Amelia laughed out loud. "I knew it!" She giggled for a bit more, then added, "Look, you're gonna have to play hardball. Otherwise, somebody else, like Amber Barton, for instance, is going to end up married to your husband." Dana didn't like the sound of that. At all. If Sam stuck around Whisper Falls, Dana would never live it down if he married someone else, especially another local. It was at that precise moment that fear settled around Dana like a nettling blanket. When she finally did speak, her voice was durable and desperate. "What am I supposed to do then?" "You know what I think you should do," Amelia said, and then let the silence linger between them. Just when Dana was ready to prompt her to say more, she added, "I think you need to go into Rosamond's cellar and pull out a really good bottle of something. What's he like to drink? Didn't you say bourbon?" "Yeah, that's what he drinks." "You got any in the cellar?" "I don't know, probably." "Well, get your ass down to the cellar, grab a bottle, and head over to the penthouse. Better yet, get Ray to take Audrey out to dinner or something. Then you can show up wearing a coat and nothing else, and offer him the bottle and dessert." Amelia's giddy laughter poured through the phone. "Tell him, 'Here, get drunk. Your woman needs attention.'" "I am not doing that." Okay. But you've got to do the booze." 15 minutes later, Dana was in her car and heading to Whisper Falls. But she was going to Amelia's house, not the penthouse. She wanted to bridge the gap between her and Sam, but she wasn't about to use sex to do it. Dana pulled into Amelia's driveway and grabbed the bottle of bourbon lying in the front passenger seat that she'd snagged from Rosamond's wine cellar. Dana climbed out of the car and headed for the front door, where she rang the bell, then fidgeted while waiting for Amelia to answer. The door opened and Dana pushed her way in, shoving the bottle of Pappy Van Winkle's Family Reserve 20-year into Amelia's hands. Holding the bottle by the neck, Amelia said, "You're supposed to take this to him, not me." Dana marched inside, where she plopped down onto the couch and began shaking her head a full 3 seconds before she said, "I'm not taking that to him. Talk about desperate." Amelia closed the door and came to Dana's side, where she stopped and stood over her. With one hand on her hip and still holding the bottle in the other, she said, "Why don't you take this over to Amber's place?" She shoved the bottle at Dana and let her deliver it to him. "Maybe they'll invite you to the wedding." Dana huffed. "Don't be ridiculous." She stopped talking long enough to roll her eyes, then said, "You're delivering it to him for me." "Ah." Amelia's voice trailed off as her eyes lit up. "That's good." She nodded. "You coming with?" Dana snorted. "Not in a million years," she said, shaking her head. "Going along will make me look desperate, like I'm begging for an invite or something to drink it with him." She laughed again, but this time it was jovial and cheerful. "Uh-uh." Amelia's brow furrowed for a moment. When it relaxed a little, Dana figured they were probably on the same page. Finally. "So you seriously want me to deliver this?" she asked. "What am I supposed to say?" Uncertainty had invaded her tone. "Just knock on the door." Dana shrugged like it was no big deal, and it wasn't. Not for somebody who was only the messenger. Say, "Delivery for Sam Treverton." And when he confirms that he's Sam, you hand him the bottle and walk away. "How's he going to know it's from you?" Good point. Dana looked up at Amelia. "You got any note cards?" "Note cards?" she asked. "You won't take the bottle to him, but you'll send it over with a note?" "Pretty much." Dana knew it sounded pathetic, but it wasn't nearly as pathetic as delivering it yourself, at which point the receiver would be obligated to invite you in for a drink. Dana didn't want to be an obligation. She wanted to be a priority. "All right," Amelia ground the words out. "Only for you," she said, stepping toward the table in the foyer where she grabbed her keys and waited for Dana to finish penning her message. When Amelia headed for the door, Dana glanced over her shoulder and said, "Be nice, okay?" as her friend left. The next 20 minutes were the longest that Dana had experienced in a long time. It was excruciating. She wanted to know how Sam reacted, the look on his face and what he said. Dana needed a bone, even if it was a tiny one. Just when she was about to crawl out of her skin, the door opened and Amelia waltzed in with a big grin on her face. When she didn't say anything, Dana's curiosity poured out of her mouth. "Was he there? Did you deliver it? What happened? What'd he say?" "Calm down," Amelia chuckled as she sat down on the couch. Dana gave her a harsh look, and she started talking. "Yes, he was there. Yes, I delivered it. I stayed long enough for him to read the card. And yes, it brought a smile to his face." She peered at Dana. "What do you write on that card, anyway?" Dana felt her cheeks go warm. With a half shrug, she said, "It's silly, really. All I said was, 'Thinking of you, thought you might like this.'" A chill rolled over her when she added the last bit. "Love, Dana." "That'll do it," Amelia said with a sobering nod. Later that evening, long after dinner and 1.5 movies on Netflix, Dana turned off the TV, grabbed her phone, and headed out to her bedroom's balcony. Easing back onto her chaise lounge, she laughed at herself as she laid her phone on the nearby table. She had foolishly thought that Sam would at least call her to say thanks for the booze, but apparently not. Amelia had delivered the bottle at approximately 1:48 this afternoon. It was now a few minutes shy of 10 o'clock. Hell, He wasn't even going to say thanks. Oh well. Dana had done all she could. If this was the way it was going to end between them, then so be it. Dana just didn't want to watch Sam be with someone else. Where could I go? She pondered as she gazed out at the starry night. Her sister-in-law, Deidre, had houses in California and Florida, and for all Dana knew, she probably had one in France, too. France. Now there was an idea. But Dana didn't speak any French. Maybe she could get Deidre to go with her. Yeah. She'd start hobnobbing with her relatives and acquaintances so she wouldn't have to live out of hotels. That way, she'd hardly ever be home, and Sam Treverton could court the hell out of Amber Barton, or anybody else in town for that matter, because Dana wouldn't be around to witness it. It didn't matter who he hooked up with. It would all hurt the same. Unless she was away. Far, far away. And maybe, just maybe, in one of those places, Dana could find herself a new dream. She reached for her phone, ready to text John and Deidre, but got sidetracked when an incoming call lit up her display. Sam. Dana's heart thumped against her chest. She queued up her friendliest voice as she answered the call with a warm, "Hello." She could hear laughter in the background. Amid the revelry, Sam said, "I just called to let you know that we're all a little bit in love with you right now." "What?" she asked, admittedly falling for it hook, line, and sinker. She could hear chatter. Sam was not alone. "This is some of the best, and I do mean best, bourbon that I have ever tasted." Sam's words weren't slurred, but she could tell he'd loosened up. Dana heard somebody yell his name, then the voices grew muffled. "That's what I said," he told his guests. "I told her we all love it. And her." He raised his voice, clearly not to Dana. "Who's there with you?" she asked, more out of curiosity than anything else. "My cousins. They're helping Audrey move some things up." That explained why he said all. Dana smiled to herself. "I'm glad you and your family are enjoying it." "So, are you forgiving me?" Was she? Dana found herself nodding. "Yeah, I think maybe I am," she said. "I still have questions, though. I really want to understand what happened between us." She shrugged. "It's the only way I can come to terms with it." "I'll answer any questions that you throw at me." "Good. But not over the phone, okay?" "Perfect," he said. "You can ask me tomorrow night." "What's happening tomorrow night?" "Well, that's another reason I called." He went silent again. Dana could hear Audrey's muffled voice, but she couldn't make out what she was saying. Finally, Sam said, "I wanted to ask you to dinner tomorrow evening." Dana wasn't expecting that, and it showed in her tone when she asked, "Like on a date?" She quickly followed it up with a slight chuckle. "Well, you did say you forgive me," he said. "I do. I forgive you." "Great. I'll pick you up about 6:30 tomorrow evening." Dana did not get the chance to accept or decline his offer because the line went dead. Chapter 23. Dana had gone down to the stables as soon as she finished breakfast Saturday morning. By the time mid-morning rolled around, she was in an incredibly good mood because Gypsy's recovery was going so well, and she had a date with Sam tonight. It didn't matter that she couldn't ride Gypsy anymore. What mattered was that Gypsy was going to live, and Dana would make sure that he was nothing but pampered from here on out. She stepped out of Gypsy's stall to tell one of the hands to bring in some fresh hay, and was a little shocked to see Ray turning the corner and heading her way. Dana's eldest brother only came down to the stables when he wanted to go for a ride, which wasn't often. Since he was dressed in a suit, she doubted he was here to stay. "What are you doing out here?" she asked. "I came down to chat with you about a thought I had." Ray stopped at her side and prolonged the mystery by propping his chin in one hand and standing there, pondering whatever was on his mind. "What do you think about inviting Sam over for dinner tonight?" He went silent just long enough to perch his hands on his hips. "We should repay him for all he's done for Gypsy." Wow. Ray wanted to invite Sam to dinner. At Rosemond. Times had changed. Ray added, "And to be neighborly, we could invite his cousin, too. Audrey is her name, I believe." Now they were getting to the heart of the matter. Dana should have known. Rarely did Ray do anything unless there was a little something in it for him. This dinner invite was no exception. Ray liked Audrey. Dana laughed to herself. "I'd really like to help you out, brother," she snickered at him. "But Sam and I already have plans for dinner tonight. We're going out." Ray's eyes widened with his smile. Even better. He was getting excited now as he pointed his finger at Dana. "Call him. Tell him to bring his cousin along, and you will bring your brother." Dana blew out a huge sigh. "Come on, Ray. Cut me some slack." She caught herself just as she was about to stomp her foot. Stopping it was awkward, but she added, as gracefully as possible, "Sam and I are finally getting back to a good place. Just do this for me, Dana." Ray was damn near begging. It got her attention. "I promise you, I will literally sell you to Sam." "Sell me?" Dana kicked her tone up a notch and bit back the urge to laugh. He had it bad for Audrey. This pleased Dana since she got the impression from Audrey that the feelings were mutual. Ray blushed as his gaze darted away from her and then quickly drifted back as he said, "You know what I mean." And then Ray did the unthinkable. Dana's brother tossed those signature puppy dog eyes at her. "Okay, fine." She blew the words out with a breath of frustration. "I'll see what I can do," she said. But Dana didn't want Ray and Audrey tagging along. Not tonight. She and Sam had to settle the past once and for all. She said firmly, "I'm not making any promises." "Great. You set it up, then let me know the details." Without waiting for her reply, Ray turned and headed off. "Hey, Ray?" Dana's voice trailed after him. When he looked over his shoulder, she added, "Why don't you call her up and ask her out yourself?" "I will," he nodded. "After tonight." "Okay, fine. But like I said," she warned him, "no promises." Ray stepped toward her. "Thanks, sis," he said, kissing her forehead. "I owe you." Dana said softly, "Then have dinner somewhere else tonight." But Ray didn't hear her. He was long gone. His head was in the clouds. Dana had never seen him like this. She was enjoying it. Big Brother Ray was smitten with Sam's cousin. Dana leaned against the wall in the main hallway of the stables, holding her phone against her ear and waiting for Sam to answer the call. A subtle click alerted her of the call's connection. Sam said, "Dana, what's up?" He sounded serious. He was probably busy. "You got a minute?" she asked. "I'm about to give a puppy his second set of shots, and I have a cat and a canary to see after that." Sam's tone deepened when he added, "Don't even say it." "What do you mean?" Dana laughed, then cleared her throat. "Hey, look, I know you're busy, so—" "You're not calling to back out, are you?" "No," Dana said sharply. That was the furthest thing from her mind. "But my brother Ray is insisting that he tag along with me and Audrey tag along with you." She heard nothing for a good 5 seconds, long enough to persuade her to look at her phone. The call was still connected. Just as she was about to prompt Sam, he said, "Are you telling me that your brother wants to go out with my cousin?" It made Dana laugh. That's it in a nutshell. "Well, I can tell you right now. There's only one way that Audrey will ever agree to have dinner with Ray." He paused, and the tone of his voice made Dana want to keep quiet. Answers be damned. But Sam chattered on anyway. And that's if he calls her and asks her himself. Chapter 24. After all the self-invites and rescheduling, Dana had started to feel like she was back in high school. She, Sam, Audrey, and Ray strolled into the Porter House, the best steakhouse in Whisper Falls, at precisely 6:48 p.m. 15 minutes later, Sam draped his arm along the back of Dana's chair and sipped his drink while eyeing Audrey and Ray. He leaned toward Dana and whispered, "Why didn't he just ask her out on his own? You know, like a grown-up?" While his words came across as harsh, his voice said something else entirely. Sam was amused. "I know, right?" Dana rolled her eyes toward Sam. "My brother, who's a bulldog in the courtroom, is afraid of a girl." She looked at Sam and grinned. "Perhaps we've found his kryptonite." Sam took a piece of Dana's hair and twined it around his finger. "How are we going to get rid of them?" he asked in a calm, even tone. She reached for her glass of wine. Holding it near her mouth, she said just above a whisper, "Maybe I can enlist Audrey's help. It'd be too obvious if you go start whispering in her ear. Like this." She tipped her glass and the wine splashed over her blouse, where it soaked through her clothes and instantly sent a chill rushing through Dana. Looking down at the stain on her blue silk top, she said, "Oh, shit." Ray and Audrey glanced at her. Ray's mouth fell open, while Audrey set her glass on the table and pushed her chair back as she stood. "Quick, to the restroom." She ushered Dana away from the table. "I'll get some club soda." It only felt like seconds had passed when Audrey came into the restroom with a bottle of club soda. "Take off your blouse." Dana did as she was asked, fumbling with the buttons as she unfastened them, then pulled it off. She handed the blouse to Audrey, and while Audrey scrubbed, Dana stood there looking at herself in the mirror. Her camisole was drenched too. If Audrey did get the stain out of the blouse, she'd be impressed. Dana had gotten the blouse when she, Lori, and Deidre had taken that trip to New York back in the spring. Dana loved it. But it'd be worth ruining if she could get Ray and Audrey to go off on their own tonight. Audrey glanced at her in the mirror while continuing to scour the blouse. "You okay? What's going on?" "What do you mean?" Dana asked, trying to tamp down her anxiety. Sure, she wanted Ray and Audrey to go away, at least for tonight. But Dana didn't want to come across looking like an asshole either. She had to find the right words. "Look, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that you are on edge." Audrey stopped scrubbing, but her eyes remained fixed on Dana. "The question is, why?" There was a kindness in her tone, and it set Dana at ease. Dana flung her hair out of her face. "It's silly, really." She let her gaze take a stroll around the room. How was she going to say this without being offensive? Well, Dana decided, that probably wasn't going to happen, so she might as well at least look at the girl when she did it. But looking into Audrey's eyes, a woman who'd been so kind to her since arriving in town, made Dana tear up. She prayed that Audrey wouldn't take what she was about to say the wrong way. "Sam and we have so much unfinished business between us that we have to clear up before we can move on," she shrugged. "And, well, we thought we were going to do that tonight." God, she hated the thought of hurting Audrey's feelings. At that precise moment, Audrey's eyes widened, and her mouth tried to smile as it dropped open. I'm sorry, Dana said, shaking her head. "I don't want to hurt your feelings. I adore you. And any other time, I'd welcome a dinner date with me and Sam and you and Ray." "Oh my God," Audrey said, almost laughing. "We're intruding, aren't we?" She began shaking her head in a very slow manner, her mouth still hanging open. "Dana, I am so sorry." "What are you apologizing for?" Dana let out a little noise that sounded like a cross between crying and laughing. I'm the jerk here. Oh my God, girl. Audrey's tone mellowed. There's not an ounce of jerk in your entire body. She turned Dana around and helped her into her damp blouse. I know, Dana sighed, sticking her arms into the blouse's short sleeves. Ain't I pitiful? Okay, so what can I do? Audrey stepped back, placed her hands on her hips, and looked at Dana in the mirror. How can I help? Well, Dana said, choosing her words carefully. I wouldn't feel comfortable asking you this unless I knew you liked my brother. It took her a second, but a smile finally tipped the corners of Audrey's mouth. Your brother is a very handsome and charming man. I could do worse. Okay. So that started off good. But by the time she got to the end, Dana wasn't sure if it was an endorsement or simply a generosity. So does that mean you like him? Audrey chuckled. Yes, I like him very much. And I will take him away, tonight, so you and Sam can iron out the wrinkles. She stopped and studied Dana's face for a long moment, then wagged her finger at her. That is the plan, right? You're going to work things out? She asked. Not end it for good, right? Look, Dana said, I love Sam. So yeah, I want to work things out. Good. Audrey let out an exaggerated sigh. Because let me tell you, Sam is never going to love anybody but you. Thanks, Dana said solemnly as she fastened the last of the buttons on her blouse. I needed to hear that. You're quite welcome, Audrey said, draping her arm around Dana's shoulders as they headed for the door. Opening it, she said, And don't worry about a thing. I'll take your brother away from here. Maybe I'll keep him away all night, she added with a grin. As soon as the women left the table, Ray turned to Sam. What happened in the Bay Area? He asked, scooting his chair closer to Sam's. What did they say at the university? The Dean of Veterinary Medicine, Janice Arrington, she used to be one of Dana's professors. Well, long story short, she took it very personal when Dana quit school. Without her approval, the school is not open to allowing Dana to complete her studies. Sam looked at Ray with guilt shading his eyes. I've got to tell her, he said, but I just don't know how. He gazed around the dining room, and when his eyes landed back on Ray, the weight of the world still resided there. After all this time, Dana and I are finally in a good place. But I don't know how she's going to take it when I have to remind her of all that I've taken from her, and everything that I cannot give back. Oh, no. This is not over. Ray waved his finger in the air. Not by a long shot. I don't know what else I can do, Sam said. I tried to use my influence. He shrugged, which apparently doesn't count for much. They have no idea who they're messing with. Ray straightened in his seat. He couldn't believe what he was hearing from Sam. The nerve of that university, trying to shut the door on Dana graduating. Hell, Ray would show them. And he'd take along a New York Times bestselling author in the very field that they were trying to control, just to remind them of exactly who and what they were dealing with. Clear your schedule Monday morning, he said to Sam. Then saw Audrey and Dana on the other side of the dining room headed their way. Ray lowered his voice a notch. You and I are going back to the Bay Area. This time, we're not leaving without what we came for. And mum's the word to my sister. For now. Dana slid back down into her chair, glanced at Sam, her brother, then Sam again, and said, You boys look like you're up to something. Sam said, Who? Us? And then he gave her this look that made her melt. Dana couldn't contain the giddiness that was quickly filling her up. There was, if she was being honest, a hint of fear knocking at the door right now. It reminded her of what it had felt like when she was forced to walk away from Sam. It begged her not to chance that happening again. It needled at her self-confidence. But Dana wasn't going to let that fear get the better of her. She wasn't going to cross any bridges until she came to them. She glanced at Audrey, who was now draped all over Ray, and he was eating it up. Audrey said to him, "I understand you have your very own helicopter." "That I do." "Look, I know this great little restaurant up at the lake," she said. "If you can get us there by 10 o'clock, I can get us a free meal." Ray laughed, stood, and reached for her hand. "Sweetheart, I'll have us there in half an hour." Dana and Sam ended up dining alone after being deserted by Ray and Audrey, but neither was complaining. After leaving the restaurant, the pair decided to walk the 5 blocks along the Riverwalk to the Sinclair penthouse that Sam and Audrey were now living in. 2 blocks in, Sam guided Dana to an empty bench just as twilight began taking over Whisper Falls. He draped his arm around her shoulders and played with the fabric of her silk blouse. She looked him square in the eye and asked, "So, what are you two up to?" Sam started shaking his head and looking as innocent as all get out, then said, from completely out of nowhere, "You know, your brother thinks that our breakup was his fault. I'll set the record straight, if you want." "No," Dana shook her head. "Let him wallow in his guilt. He wears it well." Sam chuckled. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." "You and my brother are up to something." Dana's voice stayed firm and even. "And I want to know what it is, in case it's going to embarrass me." "I promise you, Dana." Sam's words trailed off. He stayed silent for a bit while he gazed adoringly into her eyes. His tone changed to one of remorse when he added, "I know I've made promises to you before that I didn't keep, and I know I've got a lot to make up for with you." "Stop." Dana couldn't let this train of thought continue. It didn't lead to anywhere good. "I know there's a lot that we have to clear up before we can move forward, at least if we want to do it without dragging massive trunk loads of baggage along behind us." She looked at him, studied his face to make sure he was listening to her. "And I am assuming that's what you want to happen. Correct me if I'm wrong." "No, you're reading me correctly," he said, fingering her hair back out of her face. Albeit distracted by his touch, Dana said, "Okay, so no more apologies about the past. Yes, I have questions that require answers, but what I don't need is any more apologies. I need promises that it's not going to happen again." She looked at him and immediately felt the tears pooling around her eyes. "Anything that you promise me from here on out, I will believe it wholeheartedly." She felt the heat warming her cheeks, so she turned away. With his finger hooked gently under her chin, Sam pulled her gaze back to meet his. "I was going to say that I promise to never embarrass you." Then he stopped, clearly thinking that one over. "Okay, so maybe I might embarrass you a little bit from time to time, but I do promise that I will never do anything to hurt you ever again. My goal in life from here on out is your happiness." "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." Sam snuggled her closer. "Now, what are your questions? Fire away. Let's get this train moving so we can get to the good part," he said with a wink. "I'm serious, Sam." "So am I." His solemn tone supported his declaration. "Let's settle this so we can move on toward happiness." "Okay." Dana blew out a huge sigh, which did nothing to settle her nerves. Sucking in a big gulp of air, she psyched herself out enough to believe it contained all the courage she needed to say, "So please, answer this truthfully. There will be no repercussions, no matter what the answer is. I just need to know." She waited for him to give her a signal of his compliance. When he nodded, she continued, "Were you seeing us both at the same time?" Without a second thought, Sam said, "No." He looked at Dana and shot her a sad sort of smile. I told you before, when I met you, that I had not seen her for at least a couple of months. That is all true. I know you said the baby died. Dana hated having to bring up something so tragic. She couldn't imagine what that was like, and she hoped she never found out. But how? What happened? Sam shrugged. They don't know. The baby was stillborn. And when did that happen? In January. She turned to him now. You said you loved me. Her frustrations rolled out in her voice when she asked, So why didn't you come back to me? It took him a good long while before he said, I went to your apartment looking for you. They said you'd moved out in December with a forwarding address in Whisper Falls. Now it was Sam's turn to sweat bullets. Dana felt sorry for him as he swabbed his face. He somehow found the courage to say what he had to say, and she was grateful that he looked her in the eyes when he said, I let my own stupid insecurities guide me from that moment forward. It was Dana's turn to say the hard parts. Because of my brother and my sister, right? Because of the way they treated you at Thanksgiving that year. Sam glanced away. I'm not proud to admit this. He shook his head, and after a beat, he looked back into Dana's eyes. But yeah, I let them convince me that I wasn't anywhere near good enough for you. Dana laughed helplessly. I think they might be confused on that score. Dana, everything I have done since then, including writing that damned book, I was trying to make myself good enough for you. There was a bitterness in his tone now, but she knew it wasn't directed at her or her family. None of it means anything without you. Chapter 25. Monday afternoon before leaving the Bay Area, Sam and Ray dropped in on Fancy to see how the pregnancy was progressing. As they drove up the winding driveway on a high hill east of Santa Rosa, Sam turned to Ray. You sure put Janice Arrington in her place, he said, reminiscing about their escapades at the university. I'm impressed. I'm a lawyer, and a good one, Ray shrugged. I can talk anybody into anything, he said confidently. But... His tone turned comical. It doesn't hurt that I'm able to plop down a big-ass check to go along with my rhetoric. Big ass. Boy, was that an understatement. Ray had included so many zeros that Sam had lost count and couldn't be sure just how much money he'd laid out to get the university to agree to let Dana graduate, if she finished her training. Which, thanks to both Sam and Ray's smooth-talking, the university agreed that if Dana spent a 6-month internship under Sam's direction at the Whisper Falls Veterinary Clinic, they would award her a diploma. From there, she would be free to take the exam to become a licensed veterinarian. And all would be right with the world, because Sam would have given Dana back what he'd taken from her. Sam maneuvered his truck along the lane leading up to Paul and Rebecca Todd's home. Fancy was hanging out along the fence line of a small pasture that bordered the Todd's front yard. Sam climbed out of the truck and headed toward Fancy. Ray followed. Sam patted the horse while talking to her about how she was feeling and telling her that Dana and Gypsy missed her fun spirit and they sent their love. Paul appeared at Sam's side. After a round of pleasantries, Sam asked, What do you plan to do with the foal? We were going to sell it, he said. Were? We're not going to be able to wait that long now. Paul sucked in a breath to get the rest of it out. We're hurting for cash, so we're going to sell Fancy. Is there no other way? Sam asked. I'm afraid not. Paul rubbed Fancy behind the ear, then turned to Sam. If you could put out a few feelers for me? I can't cut a deal. I need top dollar. Sam knew what that meant. His friend was in trouble and Sam could help. He would help. I'll buy her. Really? And I'll pay a fair market price. Ray glanced over his shoulder at the horse trailer carrying Fancy that they were towing behind Sam's truck. You and Paul must be really good friends, he said. You buy his horse, and he loans you a trailer to get her home in. Yeah, except I have no home to take her to, Sam laughed. I'm sure you could talk Dana into boarding her for you. You're probably right. Sam nodded, then shrugged. But that's not quite what I had in mind. Ray glanced at Sam, and when Sam didn't say anything more, Ray urged him to continue. Well, don't keep me in suspense. I bought the horse for Dana. He knew Fancy would never replace Gypsy, but at least Dana could ride her. She's lost so much. Ray nodded and broke into satisfied laughter. And it might help soften the blow when Dana finds out she has to intern under you for the next 6 months if she wants to graduate. You think she'll be upset? Ray got this look on his face that reminded Sam of a frightened little boy. One thing I can tell you about my little sister, he said, and you'll do well to remember it. Dana does not like to be told what to do, under any circumstances, and not by anyone. I don't want to tell her what to do, Sam said. I just want to help her graduate. Here's the key to dealing with Dana. Just let her think it's her idea. That sounded like dangerous territory to Sam, but he would defer to her brother's lead. After all, Ray did know her better than he did. But Sam intended to fix that. I want Fancy to be a surprise, though, Sam said. Is there any way we can get her into the stables without Dana knowing? I can get her in, Ray said. But it won't be a secret for long. Dana lives in those stables. After declaring the impossibility of it, he added, But I've got a whole plan figured out. Just leave it to me. Dana was going to wring her brother's neck. She had no idea what he and Sam were up to, but whatever it was, they were in cahoots. She was sure of it. First, Ray had called Audrey up and asked her to get Dana out of the house by inviting her to dinner. Dana had only found out about this once Audrey confessed, after Ray called them away from the restaurant to come home. She wasn't mad at Audrey. Dana got that she was only trying to be helpful. Now, as for Sam and Ray, her level of anger would depend upon what they had done. She couldn't wait to get home to find out, and she wasn't fooling herself that it was automatically going to be something good. Oh, sure, Dana was trying to be optimistic these days, but better safe than sorry. When they arrived at Rosemond, Dana didn't see Sam's truck parked among the other cars, and she started to worry. Wasn't that how they'd gotten to the Bay Area? She still didn't understand why Ray had to go with him to check on Fancy. Dana and Audrey climbed out of the car and headed for the side porch that led to a sunroom where all of the family and Sam were waiting. She instantly relaxed at the sight of him. What's going on? She asked, specifically to Sam as she went to his side. Ray and I have some news. Sam was beaming. He was incredibly proud of whatever it was that he and Ray had done. Well, don't keep me in suspense, she said with a hint of laughter. Okay, he said with a nod. You can graduate. What? She asked, reaching for his arm to steady herself. How is that possible? Dana had talked to them a few weeks ago and they'd shot her down promptly. She looked at Ray. Did you buy my diploma? He took several seconds to ponder his answer. Finally, he shook his head, saying, No. I did, however, make a generous donation. She laughed. Not a jovial or gleeful laugh, but one born out of futility. Of course. You bought my diploma. Not exactly, Sam said. She didn't like the worried look in his eyes. I have to go back to school? She asked, her tone showing her disapproval. Dana and Sam were finally in a good place, here in Whisper Falls. She didn't want a long-distance relationship, not even for a few months. They had already wasted too much time. She didn't want to waste any more. Sort of, Sam said. You'll intern with me at the clinic for 6 months. Ray beamed with pride as he said, "At that time, the university will issue you a diploma. You can even walk at graduation, if you want." Dana huffed. "Did you two ever think to ask me what I wanted?" "Told you she wasn't going to like it," Ray said to Sam with a hint of a comedic tone. "Not like it?" Dana bored a hole through Ray first, then Sam. "I'm not doing it." "Dana, be reasonable," Ray said. She gazed around the sunroom at her family, who for the most part were just standing there looking as dumbstruck as she felt. Nobody could manage to utter a single thought besides the two fools standing in front of her. "Both of you should have asked me before you committed yourselves and a boatload of money to a cause that I gave up on a long time ago." Dana shot a hard glare at Sam. How dare he? He wasn't supposed to be like the rest of the family, whose only goal seemed to be about running her life. No, Sam was supposed to be different. He was supposed to be on her side. "You people can have my share," Sam said, shooting his own glare at Dana. "I'm done." She stood there watching him leave, the door slamming shut as he went. Once he disappeared around the side of the house, she turned her gaze to Ray. "What's he talking about?" Ray said, "We bought the clinic from Cal." "What?" Dana's tone was soft and did nothing to hide the hurt that was filling her up. She looked at her father. He said, "I told your brother to buy the clinic and find someone to partner with until you decided what you wanted to do." Ray Sr. then pointed an accusatory finger at Dana's oldest brother. "I did not tell him to bring Sam into the picture. He did that all on his own." Dana's gaze, fueled by contempt, traveled back to her eldest brother and settled there. Ray began backpedaling. "I did that for you, Dana. I was trying to right the wrong that I did to you and Sam back then." "You people keep trying to orchestrate my life for me," Dana said, letting all her anger pour out. "When is this going to stop?" But she didn't want an answer from any of them, because any answer other than never was going to be a lie. She glanced over her shoulder at Audrey, who was standing in the doorway and looking like she wasn't sure if she should stick around or run. Dana decided to help her with that decision. She'd show Ray just what it felt like to have someone constantly interfering in your life, trying to run it for you. She said to Audrey, "Don't get mixed up with my brother. You see what he does to blood. Can you imagine what he'll do to those who marry in?" Dana squeezed past Audrey and headed outside to look for Sam. His truck wasn't in the driveway, and Audrey had ridden in with Dana. Where had he gone to? She followed the direction he'd disappeared in, which led to the stables, and wondered if he'd gone down there. Maybe he had. Maybe he'd gone to check on Gypsy. As she neared the stables, Sam came strolling out. Ray probably called him to warn him, she thought, and laughed softly about it. She buried her fingertips in the pockets of her blue jeans and looked up at Sam shyly as she approached him. "I have something for you," he said. "But before I show you what it is, I want to know why you don't want to work with me at the clinic." Sam was clearly hurt by her reaction. "I thought this was our dream, Dana." "It is. I do, Sam." She hesitated, trying to regain a bit of composure. "I just want it to be on my terms. I'm sick of my brother trying to orchestrate my life behind my back." "I get that," he said, nodding. "I truly didn't mean to go behind your back. I just wanted to save you the pain of getting your hopes up and then having me pull the rug out from under you again." There was pain in his voice, his words, his demeanor. "If it makes you happy, you can intern under Audrey, and I'll stay away on the days you're at the clinic." Dana shook her head. "That's no good." "What do you mean?" "You just gonna leave me now? High and dry?" She strolled toward him. "Again?" Sam shrugged. "I'd never leave you, unless you asked me to." "Well?" I'm not asking you to, she said, and wrapped her arms around him. Sam welcomed her embrace. Now, what'd you get me? Sam draped his arm around her shoulders and led her into the stables. You're gonna like this. Is it something for Gypsy? In a manner of speaking. They turned a corner and he pointed down the hallway. Look. Gypsy's head was hanging out of his stall, interacting with the horse next door. That stall was empty, wasn't it? And then she saw a head bobbing up and down on the other side of Gypsy. Fancy! She looked at Sam. Are we boarding her now? Sam shook his head. Dana asked, Then why is she here? Did the breeding not take? Oh no, it took. Sam grinned at Dana. She lives here now. She's all yours. What? Dana was ready to be excited, for herself and Gypsy, but then a dreadful thought entered her head. Did my brother buy her? Sam shook his head. It was me. I did it. Sam, this is too much, she said, petting both Gypsy and Fancy. I'm going to reimburse you. No need. Sam draped his arm around Dana and brushed his lips against her cheek. It's okay. I saved up for it. Epilogue, 6 months later. It hadn't been easy to book a day in late February at the Whisper Falls Country Club. It helped that the Sinclair family, especially Dana's brother Ray, had connections and knew the right people to hit up if you wanted to grab one of those coveted saved spots that venues and hotels always reserve for last-minute priority guests and for when something simply goes wrong. Thanks to Ray, Dana was now Mrs. Sam Treverton, and the wedding had gone off without a hitch. All of Dana's family and friends and Sam's family and friends were there to witness their joyous day. Audrey, who was Ray's official date for the wedding, slipped up beside Dana. She had caught the bouquet. Do you want this back? She asked, and Dana knew from Audrey's tone that giving up that bouquet was the last thing she wanted to do. No, Dana laughed. You keep it. It's not the one I carried down the aisle. Dana touched a white rose in the arrangement. I know this one means as much to you as the one I carried means to me. You keep it. Thank you. And it does, Audrey said, then sucked in a breath before continuing. I know you and your brother have had your differences recently, but he's extremely proud of you. She shrugged. And so am I. You've received your diploma and you aced the licensing exam. Congratulations twice, Dr. Sinclair. Or is that Dr. Treverton now? They both laughed. I'm so glad that you didn't listen to me. I'm sorry for what I said and how I said it, Dana said, ashamed of the way she'd behaved. My brother is a good man, and he does mean well. Thanks for not listening to me. I'm just glad you two are speaking again, Audrey said. I'm still waiting for our double dinner date, though, she added with a wink. Dana hugged Audrey. I'm so glad we're cousins now. Is there any chance that we might one day be sisters? You know what you Sinclair's problem is? Audrey asked in a playful manner. What's that? You're all control freaks. Both women laughed again. But this time, Ray swept in and pulled Audrey away from Dana and sashayed her off to the dance floor. Sam stepped up beside Dana. If we're not careful, he said with a hint of laughter, my cousin is going to end up being my sister-in-law. Well, I don't mind if you don't. Dana flashed him a soft smile. As long as they're not going to invite themselves along on our honeymoon, Sam said. I don't care what they do. Oh, don't you worry, Mr. Treverton. Dana shook her head. I haven't told a soul where we're going. Good, because I've got plans for you, Mrs. Treverton. He shot her a wink and a grin. Big plans. Those plans had been a long time coming, And Dana Sinclair Treverton couldn't wait to get started. And the best part of all, she was doing it with the love of her life, her soulmate. Dana smiled as she looked up into Sam's loving gaze. She was now officially one of the lucky ones. This has been Yesterday's Promise, Billionaire Games Book 5, written by Sandra Edwards, narrated by Heather Masters. Copyright 2016 by Sandra Edwards. Production copyright 2017 by Sandra Edwards.